Now I'm excited to turn it over to Ariella to dive into the presentation.
Great, thank you, Sunila. And thank you to SIX for organizing this briefing, and to all of you for having us here to present to you on the National Taskforce on Election Crises, lessons from the primary elections, and how you as legislators can help ensure safe and secure election this fall. My name is Ariella Rosenberg, and I help staff the task force. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are. So the National Task Force on Election Crises is a diverse cross-partisan group of more than 50 experts in election law, election administration, national security, cybersecurity, voting rights, civil rights, technology, media, public health, extremely important with the pandemic, and emergency response. Our mission, as you'll see on the screen here, is to ensure a free and fair 2020 presidential election by recommending responses to a range of election crises. And the only electoral outcome that the task force advocates for is that the election is free and fair. You'll see here that we have a very esteemed list of members, 53 members. I'll just highlight a few here.
Sorry, Ariella, I think you gotta advance the slides.
Are they not moving? Are they not moving?
They're not, but I'm happy to also swap over if that's helpful.
Huh. That might be helpful because they're moving on my screen.
Yeah, no problem. Feel free to keep it going and I can pull up my screen share.
Sorry about that, everyone.
No worries.
Well, so I'll tell you about a few of our members. We have former DHS Secretary Michael Chertoff and the former FBI General Counsel Jim Baker. We also have voting and civil rights leaders like Vanita Gupta of the Leadership Conference, and civil society leaders like the heads of the League of Women Voters and Common Cause, numerous election experts, and also election administrators, including Jennifer Morrell, who's here with us today to help present to you all and help answer any of your questions. The task force is working to ensure three things. The first is that the election runs smoothly during challenging circumstances. The second is that disputes are handled in a way that maximizes confidence in the final outcome. And the third is that there's a peaceful transition or continuation of power on January 20th, 2021. We've previously issued guidance on a number of issues. In March, we issued guidance on COVID-19 and how to vote safely during the pandemic. I've seen things move around. Is this still working?
Great,
Great, okay, I will continue. We issued guidance on COVID-19. We issued a paper on whether or not the president can postpone an election. The answer is no. You may have heard from us. We actually sent a letter to state legislators in April advocating for additional funding to implement our recommendations on securing a safe election during COVID-19. In the coming weeks and months, you'll see additional guidance from us on remedies in election contests, whether or not a state legislator can override the results of a popular election, and the Electoral Count Act. So there are a few things we'd like to discuss with you today. The first is why 2020 is so different and what we can learn from the pandemic primaries to prevent a crisis for the general election. The second is how you can help in your specific roles as state legislators. The third is how the task force can be a resource for you. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A with Jennifer and my colleague, Corey Dukes, is also on the line. I'll say up front that we have three main takeaways we'd like for you to take from this presentation. The first is that clear communication, up, down, and sideways, and with your governor, secretary of state, election administrators, your constituents, really just across the board is critical in these really confusing and difficult times when running an election. And the task force is here to help you guide them. The second is that there's really a need for robust options for voting in this election, and that includes both in person and in mail. And both of those should be done as early as possible, and you should encourage your constituents to do that. And the third is that on the back end, if you're able to pass laws that allow for ballots to be postmarked by November 3rd, and to start processing ballots before election day, that will go a long way towards helping to prevent a crisis. I'll now pass it over to Jennifer Morrell, a member of the task force and a great example of the expertise that we have on the task force, to talk a little bit about the current moment and takeaways from the primaries.
Great, thank you, Ariella, and thanks to SIX for letting me be here today. I'm really excited to have a chance. I hope just to have a conversation with you. So I'll start though by introducing myself. As Ariella said, I'm Jennifer Morrell. I spent about 8 years running local elections in both Utah and Colorado, most of that time in Colorado. And then I left that to sort of be, I guess, a national evangelist for election audits. I had the Democracy Fund's Election Validation Project, and we focus on the use of audit standards and testing to increase trust in elections. I also am a partner in an election consulting firm, and we provide a lot of support, especially right now, to a number of states and local jurisdictions who are dealing with just unprecedented challenges and change, as I'm sure you can all imagine. I'm really excited to be part of the task force. It started for me almost a year and a half ago in a small room that has now grown to a very large group of just remarkable, talented individuals who started talking about some of the challenges or scenarios that could occur in a presidential election. And I remember thinking, this seems really looking down the rabbit hole for things that could potentially go wrong. And it's amazing to me how valuable those conversations, those early conversations were in our ability to respond to things that are happening to us today. And I really draw a lot. I spent a few years in the military, in the Air Force, and that was one of the things we were always doing, right? Is sort of thinking through all of the different situations that could occur and what the contingencies were. I'm sure that's part of what drew me into elections. And what I love about the task force is, as an election administrator, and I'm one of the few sort of non-academics in this group, we have just some remarkably smart, intelligent individuals. But what I love is that as an election administrator, most of the resources, most of the things that we turn to inform the way we do our work are focused in logistics and process. And what's unique about the task force is they answer all of those questions that I'm not sure anybody else is answering. And that's the things that can happen, in addition to things that could go wrong prior to the election and good practices around that, but really thinking about from election day to inauguration day, and looking at you know, the way the law would interpret different situations. And their work speaks for itself, but I really would encourage everyone to take a look at that, because I think it's just a valuable, valuable tool. Okay, so moving on, why is 2020 completely different? And if we can advance the slide, thanks. What I'm going to share with you, I think are things that you've heard already. I hope that this conversation just sort of reiterates things that you've been thinking about, things that you've been seeing in the news, and we can answer some specific questions at the end of this. As you know, the pandemic has changed everything. In addition to planning for what probably was going to be a very high turnout presidential election that still required a high degree of precision and planning and bringing in you know, resources and support. Now election officials are dealing with fewer poll workers, increased costs, all of these precautions, barriers, things like that have to be in place. And this sort of unprecedented number of mail-in or absentee ballots that we're seeing. And as a result of that, we know that election results probably will not be available on election night, that we're going to see that period of results reporting expanded. And we also know that there's the potential for, if results are close, for the losing side, wherever that is, up and down the ticket, to not accept the outcome because of all of these changes. We also know that election administrators are overwhelmed. They're still underfunded, but I will say that they are meeting these challenges head on in just about every state we've worked with. They are amazing superheroes. In addition to that, the security concerns have not gone away. So we're really focused on pandemic and the implications of that and this expanded use of vote by mail, but all of the security considerations around foreign interference, mis and disinformation, those are all still there and present and have to be sort of dealt with. And then, you know, we've got this political unrest and some of the widespread protests that we've seen. So essentially 2020, we are operating in uncharted waters, and I can't reiterate that enough. Like, I'm sure you feel that as policymakers. I certainly feel that providing election support, that every day I get asked questions about how should we deal with such and such, or, you know, what would be the best approach. And I think I don't know, because we've never faced this before. But the important thing is that those of you watching today, sit in a position of trust. Your constituents trust you, and the task force is here to help you as you communicate with them and can guide you through that. Okay, so next slide. So we wrote this report on things that we could learn from the primaries. And I'm sure, again, I don't have to reiterate this. They were some of the most challenging primaries we've seen. We provided some recommendations to decision makers about how to prevent some of those same challenges from happening in November, to ensure we have safe and secure participation in the election and really maximize confidence in the outcome while still preparing for the worst. And that's, I think, such a challenge, because we want to communicate realistic expectations to voters, but we don't want to do so in a way that might dampen their desire to vote. And so it's sometimes a conundrum, and I'm sure you all face that as well. After canvassing states, we came up with a list of recommendations. On the screen, you'll see the 4 main takeaways. Again, no surprises here, but hopefully just to reiterate what you're already thinking about, and that's that early voting is an important element of making voting safer and more accessible. Absentee voting certainly played a central role in voting during the pandemic, and it will continue to play, I think, a very central role as we move in 75 days from now into November. In-person voting on election day continues to be a crucial option for many voters, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then number 4, and I just don't think we can overstate how important communications and media coverage are, how important it is that the things that we say and how we say them, and the effect that that has on voter trust and confidence. So let's dive a little bit more in depth to these. Next slide. And I'm just going to kind of cover some really high level things, and I may delve into a couple of these in more detail. Certainly if there's anything on here you want to talk about in the Q&A period, we can do that. All of these items are covered in depth in the post-primary report from the task force. So early voting, maximizing that early voting period and eliminating unnecessary restrictions on early voting. This was as well as promoting the availability and benefits of early voting widely. We know that this was an important element for making voting safer during the primaries. A great example of this came from Nebraska, where we had uniform messaging. They had a strategic plan statewide for recruiting poll workers, and really sort of thinking about amongst all their counties how they were going to administer this in a way that would encourage voters to come out and take advantage of that early voting period. And really what we're trying to do is really eliminate the pressures and risks of having everybody come on election day, and making sure that there are alternatives for voters who don't feel comfortable voting by mail or don't get their mail ballot in time. Certainly, again, there were challenges during the primaries that included insufficient early voting periods or other restrictions around early voting, as well as just the problem of poll worker recruitment and retention. So for November, states really need to think about, like I said, how to maximize that and how to coordinate that. All right, let's move on. Next slide. So this is probably my favorite, no surprise, coming from Colorado, also Utah, both vote at home states, states with universal vote by mail, whatever we're comfortable calling it, states that also allow for early voting and in-person voting and election day voting. But I think we're seeing this idea of absentee voting really taking a central role during this pandemic. And we saw that in the primaries, and we've outlined that in the report. So we have some not so great examples, I guess, if we look at like Ohio, where we saw a lot of confusion and disagreement about how voting would be conducted, or New York, where it took weeks to count ballots. And some of those things can be solved with good policy. Some really do draw on better practices and processes that election officials can control. So it's a mix of both. But in terms of legislation and thinking about just the record number of people who voted by mail during the primaries and probably will vote by mail in November as well, how to like increase success for that. So let's think first about some of the challenges. We know we saw some issues with timely ballot delivery and return and accommodating voters with different needs. Certainly we saw higher rates of ballot rejection for November. So qualifying the COVID-19 pandemic as an excuse, so sort of broadening people's ability to take advantage of that. Again, this is has a direct impact on what election day will look like, on what early voting will look like. So if we can allow those voters to have some other alternative to that, we lessen the pressure on the system for in-person. And I'll just kind of bookmark that idea too about COVID as an excuse, because it also plays a role in in-person curbside or drive-up voting. We'll talk about that in a minute. Allowing voters to apply for absentee ballots as early as possible. And I think we're seeing a lot of this. Like most of the states I'm working with are thinking about education campaigns to really encourage voters to check their registration early, apply for their absentee ballot early, return it as early as possible to try to mitigate any of these process challenges or last minute things that might happen, issues with the US Postal Service. I think any messaging you can do to support that will be helpful, but I'm gonna talk specifically about something that I think is so important. Well, two things. One, the deadline for returning absentee ballots. Anything that can be done to extend that to postmark or to allow for votes, you know, put in the mail and postmarked by, but not received until a later date, I think is going to be important. The big one for me is processing ballots as early as possible. And this gets back to this late reporting that we saw in New York. We've seen this in other jurisdictions during the primary as well. I hope that some of you want to talk about this during the Q&A, because I think there is some confusion between counting and processing. States that do elections primarily by mail think of it as processing, meaning getting that ballot from the time it comes in from the Postal Service or from ballot drop boxes, checking it in, accounting for it, doing signature verification, prepping it, opening it, putting them through the scanner. It seems like something that could be done fairly quickly, but each of those steps requires a set of verifications and reconciliations, and sometimes ballots are damaged or there are issues with voter intent that need to be resolved. And as much as we can change that deadline from election day to some earlier date, gives that local official time to go through all of those steps and go through all of those steps properly. And then we still save the counting for after the polls close, but really need to, at some point, if not this election going forward, distinguish between processing and counting. And then the last two on there are just sending absentee voting applications and ballots with postage prepaid, and then expanding and promoting the use of ballot drop boxes. And I'm happy to talk more about ballot drop boxes if anybody has questions later around security or things like that on those. Okay, next slide.
Great. There's a question in the chat about drop boxes, which we can get to during the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Unless you'd like to get to it now, but we can get to it later.
Let me look, do we know? Sorry, we can answer it now if you want, since we're on that.
Sure.
Okay, so the question is, do we know if states have extra secure ballot drop boxes? Oh, this is from Hawaii. They're struggling with sort of the supply chain and getting drop boxes to them. If you, Chris, can either at the end of this, I will send you a link to a resource that would be helpful. If you can't find those secure 24-hour boxes that are permanent, there are some good options for some temporary solutions, both that are staffed and manned, both inside a voting location as well as some drive-through options. And I've got a whole set of guidelines that you can use from supplies to procedures to chain of custody and security around those. Everybody is looking for those permanent secure boxes right now. So, but I do have a full list of vendors I can send you if it's helpful. Okay. In-person voting. as much as we are excited to talk about absentee voting, and I say that jokingly, it just seems to be what's in the news and what's filling up my inbox this week. But in-person voting is still so crucial that we get this right and that we provide options here. If you'll notice in the previous slides, we had some of those things in bold with a little star that said, here's where we need some legislative policy. In-person voting, some of the recommendations here around that focus on eliminating or restricting in-person options. Well, let me rephrase that. If we eliminate or restrict in-person voting options, we can create this disproportionate burden on certain communities. And again, I'm sure you're all aware of that. But we saw that as a problem in the primary. In addition, we saw jurisdictions that canceled in-person election day voting entirely. And we also saw some of the struggles and challenges that they had around poll worker recruitment and retention, training, polling place closures, long lines, and insufficient communication with voters and poll workers. So what do we need for success in November? You'll see that none of these are bolded. This is one of the few areas where a lot of the suggestions do fall squarely on the shoulders of election administrators, but certainly they are important areas that could use support from policymakers like yourselves. So aggressively and creatively recruiting poll workers. You heard me mention Nebraska, and I'll just sort of bring them up again where they work directly with I can't think of the name of the professional organization, but essentially it was like the accounting organization of the state, like all the CPAs, and they were able to work with them to provide some of the shortages. We know that there are groups nationally sort of trying to help with that effort to work with civic groups, colleges, and other places to help recruit poll workers. So helping your local, state, and local officials tap into those will be really important, as well as your National Guard. They've certainly played a really important role during the primaries. Keeping as many polling places open as possible for as long as possible. And you notice nobody's dictating what that looks like. It's just saying to the extent possible, we need to find ways to keep those open, knowing that there are hurdles to some of those locations in terms of their availability because of COVID. Expanding curbside or drive-up voting. So I mentioned this when we were talking about the COVID being a legitimate excuse for requesting an absentee ballot. I think the question I've seen the most over the last couple of weeks are, what do we do if an individual shows up to vote on election day and they self-identify as being sick or having symptoms? And this is one of those areas where we're looking at sort of something new that we've never had to deal with before, but a curbside or drive-up option seems to be the best solution, providing that voter the services that they're entitled to while still keeping voters and other poll workers safe. Ensuring poll workers are adequately informed and trained. Again, we're in new territory as states and local jurisdictions are thinking about ways to use a virtual environment just like this to conduct what normally would be an in-person training experience. And then preparing for increased provisional voting and making sure that we exempt voting activities from any curfew orders. Okay, next slide. Last one, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is really the most critical of all of these. Election administrators, as I mentioned, are amazingly resilient. They're coming up with really innovative responses to a lot of these challenges. They seem to be thinking through, ways to meet them, ways to recruit, ways to train, better ways to set up polling locations. They seem to all have learned from primaries how to more efficiently get ballots out to voters, how to more efficiently process ballot applications. But this communication piece, it's tough, and I think we need everybody really thinking about how to validate and reinforce what does voting look like in your state or your jurisdiction? What has changed? What's different? Helping voters understand how to navigate that and how to sort of create a plan ahead of time, I think is going to be important. Managing public expectations about the timing of election results. Again, I think we're all starting to recognize that those are going to look different than they have, but that doesn't mean that we can't be confident about them. We just need to think about them in context of what has changed since 2016. The percentage of mail ballots, showing voters, look, in 2016, we maybe only saw 2% statewide. Now we've got 80%. And also, as we're counting those, being really open and transparent about what has been counted, what's still left to be counted, what are we counting? Are we talking about in-person ballots, mail ballots, provisional ballots, and giving voters and the public and candidates and other stakeholders some realistic expectations, but also showing them that things are proceeding just fine. They're just moving a little bit slower, perhaps not. We may all be surprised. I think I've mentioned already encouraging voters to be proactive and really think about how to request, make those requests or changes to their voter registration or request those mail ballots as early as possible. And then just thinking about ways to, again, support your election administrator, again, your state or local election administrator. Be careful about the information you share, that it's accurate, and that you're not sharing or repeating things that might undermine confidence in the election. That your trusted source for election information, for better or worse, I hear people say, yeah, but my local election administrator's website's not that great. I get it. They're not all perfect and wonderful, but they're going to be the most accurate source of information. So looking to your state officials, looking to your local officials, I would encourage everybody to really focus on that and focus on that trusted info. Okay, so with that, I will hand it back to Ariella to talk about your role in all of this. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, so as Jennifer mentioned, state legislators will play a really important role in protecting the integrity of our elections in November. If we can go to the next slide, we have a list here of what you can do right now, today, to help prevent a crisis, and Jennifer touched on a lot of these points. The first is learn about your state's election preparations and identify gaps. We encourage you to read our task force and see how your state stacks up against the recommendations. So as Jennifer was just saying, support the election officials in your state. That can include increasing funding, listening to their election wish list, and passing the legislation that's necessary to achieve it. And after a certain point, drawing a line between when election administrators can be expected to implement new things and when we need to just support them as they administer this election with all the tools that they have. We've said this before, and we'll say it again, passing a law to start processing absentee ballots before Election Day is really, really important. As is allowing for ballots to be postmarked, not just received by November 3rd. And lastly, have a real conversation with the legislator on the other side of the aisle. Bipartisanship will be really important in the face of a crisis. We can go to the next slide. It'll be really important also to educate your constituents on how things are supposed to work and what they should expect in this election. This will help keep them informed and also instill confidence in the final results. You might get questions about what the rules are like for drop boxes and postmarks. All of these things will be new to them. And so helping to frame that information will be really helpful. I think you'll also be seeing questions about how the voting process has changed. This will not look like the election in 2016. I think being able to really clearly lay out the new rules and highlight the deadlines will be a huge value add for your constituents. And finally, it's really important to manage public expectations about the timing of election results for this election. Given the huge numbers of absentee ballots we're expecting, it's very likely that this will not be election day, but could be election week and potentially even weeks if we see a really big crisis. Finally, we ask that you communicate really clearly and consistently in the media about the way things are supposed to go and when they happen. It's really important to guide the public about when they should be concerned and when they should remain calm, and they will look to you as leaders for those guideposts. We can help you answer those questions. An example of this might be if like a flurry of litigation after the election would be normal, but someone calling for a slate of electors to be certified would not, and we're happy to guide you in those situations. It's also really important to not engage with disinformation. Jennifer spoke about this a little bit it's not even worth like trying to debunk it. Just stick to affirming the truth so that those ideas are not like percolating. And lastly, we would ask that you encourage people to vote, to request and return absentee ballots as early as possible, and then also to vote, and if possible, vote early, whether they're doing so in person or by mail. Go to the next slide. So we can help you with all of this. You know, this is a lot. There are a lot of shifts that are happening. The task force is a resource for you. And so we just ask that you let us know what you're worried about and how we can help. Also say that the primaries can only prepare us for so much. There will be a long post-election period with multiple potential crisis points. The task force has studied and is studying these scenarios in depth. And there might be all types of things that come up. And so we're here to help you prepare for those scenarios and help you respond in the moment. I'll open it up now for questions with Jennifer and Corey. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks so much. So folks are free to ask questions in the chat if you'd like, or use the Q&A function. There are also a number of questions that were submitted in advance that we can turn to as well. So I'll just give it a few seconds. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so I can be a little freer with my desktop and check out some other screens with questions. All right, I'm going to jump in with a question that we received in advance. We got a number actually. So there was a question about concerns about the post office, of course, and folks from Connecticut specifically looking for any and all tips on how to help ensure voters have confidence in the integrity of the elections and to support earlier requests of absentee ballots as well as new drop boxes. So I think there's both a question of how to instill confidence given the crisis with the Postal Service, and also how best to advocate for some of the changes, perhaps from a tactical standpoint, in terms of ballot drop boxes and extended absentee voting processing deadlines and offerings. So kind of how to make the case for some of that.
I'm sure Corey has some thoughts on the post office, but I'll sort of chime in first. And Sunila, maybe make sure I answer all of those pieces of the question. So one of the challenges, the challenge with the post office isn't entirely new in that election administrators have always had this challenge of the statutory date for voters to request a mail ballot and the time frame that we knew the post office already had in place for, even with first class mail, getting a ballot to a voter and getting it back. Like those have always been a little bit at odds with each other. I think certainly now we're seeing that that's growing, right? They're even more at odds with each other. And so the messaging is still the same, and that is request early, return early. Yeah, I'm not really sure what else to add there other than just taking advantage of all of the ways that you can communicate with voters. So that might be the insert in your mail ballot packet, it might be the back of the mail ballot envelope, it might be some other type of print media, it might be information on your website, it might be information that you share with stakeholders and community organizers that they can share with their members, but just having like a coordinated communication plan, I think in terms of trust and the issues with deadlines and delivery times, I think that communication plan really has to take priority and needs to have probably more resources devoted to it now than it has before. We've certainly seen success where the state has coordinated some of that. So they've sort of taken some role in helping to coordinate that message as well. Well, remind me of the ballot drop box question, just security around the drop box or communicating about the drop box?
I think it was more of supporting the addition of drop boxes and how to kind of get that done given threats to the Postal Service. And I'd actually be curious if folks could kind of speak to that tension right now about whether this is a moment to actively pursue some of those other options, given threats that USPS is facing, and how people can kind of navigate that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from folks on the line. I'll just add that the number one thing around ballot drop boxes is people need to know they're there and where they're at in order to use them. So if they're indoor drop boxes, then there's some constraints around days and times that a building's open. Your voters need to know that. If they're outdoors, they need to know where they're located, and they need to know that they're available 24 hours a day, and that there's security around that. There's security cameras, those sorts of things. If it's a drive-through option, they need to know that. Those are normally options reserved just for election day or just in the build-up towards election day. So thinking about how you're going to get that information to voters is really the best way to promote that. And then anything else that comes with that. So how to use it, how are they secure, those sorts of things. Two things I'll say on that is it really does help expedite the process. So putting a ballot in a drop box means it's going to be processed that much quicker by the local election official. And I think that this year is going to be really important. Happy to talk more about security concerns, but I'll just leave it at that.
Great. We have another question in our Q&A function, and I'll read it and also drop it in the chat. So it's, do you have any tips or strategies on how to get local or national media coverage to begin coverage now that election results likely won't be available on November 3rd?
Yes, there are actually some specific resources, and I don't have them at my fingertips for training local media. I think they're getting that message. I've talked to many over the last month or so. I know the task force has organized conversations with many of the media outlets and content providers specifically focused on this. So I think there's definitely a growing understanding that that's happening. But I will make sure, in addition to the ballot Dropbox guide, Sunila, that I send you the, there is a training for media around this that's available. It's called like SOS or something. I'll send that to you.
And hey, this is Corey Dukes. My video's not working, but if I could add one thing to what Jennifer said there, it's that the Task Force on Election Crises, one of its roles is to communicate with the media. And so the task force has been having meetings with national news outlets and platforms to include Google, Twitter, Facebook, New York Times, the Associated Press, to try to train them up on these very issues, right? Folks are going to be looking, and local news will be following the national outlets on these things. And so installing best practices during the primary season in terms of setting expectations for voters, helping them understand how many votes have been counted versus how many precincts are in. Those are things that are very, very important, both on the local and national level. And it's something that the task force feels is one of its key functions.
Awesome, thanks, Corey. So we got another question in, hello. We got another question in advance from West Virginia, and I'll put this in the chat as well and read it. So our legislature is being held at a standstill. What can I implement independent of being in the chamber to protect our voters? Are there programs and resources I should be actively pursuing? So I think some of this, would love to maybe hear kind of a reiteration of some of the extra policy making duties and options that legislators can be pursuing.
So if I understand you right, you're saying, well, short of policy changes right now, and I mean, let's be honest, we have an election in 75 days. And so I think, just to reiterate, supporting your local official, checking in with them, finding out what they need. I think one thing that I'm sure will crop up again that we saw in the primary was use of the National Guard, just to fill in some gaps, meaning non-uniformed, working in their own communities. So I think there's opportunities to coordinate that. I think any other opportunities you have to work with groups that you might be connected with within your state to support poll worker recruitment will be really important. And then just the communication things that we've emphasized. Corey, can you think of others?
I mean, I personally come back to communication. You know, I think that one thing that you folks play a really important role in is there's so much noise out there, and there's so much confusion, there's a lot of fear, and legislators are very close to the ground. They understand their communities very well, and they understand both the messages that their constituents need to hear and the kind of media through which they need to hear those messages, or through which those messages can best be conveyed. So, you know, I think the task force in general serves a role in try to demystify this stuff and just say, you know, get your hands around the facts and disseminate those facts as broadly as you can.
And if I can add one thing to that, one thing that was really successful for me when I was serving as the director of elections in Arapahoe County in Colorado was inviting all of my legislators in to walk through the process of everything from registration to ballot processing to results reporting, and making sure that they understood the process and felt confident in it, because I knew that people would be turning to them to have that same confidence. So if your local election official hasn't offered you that, I would suggest go to them. And I'm sure there are many, because you probably cover it. I don't know the size of your district, but go and ask if you could just have a tour of the facility and understand how things are going to play out, both during early voting, the absentee process, and on election day, so that you're in a good position to communicate to your constituents what is normal and expected, and that's part of the disinformation, and also be able to be alerted if something isn't going the way it should be. You'll know that too. So, you know, learning the process, I think, is important.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'll toss out a couple of other just things of note. So we haven't talked about just the flurry of litigation that's happening at the state level, coming from a lot of different entities, political parties, nonpartisan, democracy advocates, and so forth. And so I think also staying in some cases on top of the litigation that's happening in your state. I'm happy to, as part of a follow-up, just share some links of collated notes on lists of ongoing active litigation on voting and elections, so you can check out what's going on in your state, and if there's a way, if there are folks who are litigating who are kind of on the side of positive voter reforms in the face of the pandemic, then you can coordinate. And if there's a way to organize yourself and your colleagues in support of that, either by submitting briefs, then that might be a route you could take and a way that you can use your power. We have another question in the chat. I'm just going to read it again out loud. You mentioned the additional resources election officials need to deal with these challenges. Are they getting them? From where are the gaps, and how can they be addressed? So, big question.
That's a great question. Obviously, the task force is a great resource, and hopefully everybody's tapped into that. Thinking about specific needs around election administration. So this is one of the coolest things about this election. It is turning into a very collaborative type environment where I think groups and organizations are realizing if we're going to be successful, we all need to work together and provide that support. So when it comes to election security, physical security, cybersecurity, that sort of thing, actually the federal government's done a great job. The Cybersecurity and Information CISA security agency has some great resources. They're all available on their website. So take a look at those. The Election Assistance Commission also has some resources, but also there are a lot of nonprofit entities like the Center for Technology and Civic Life, a number of training webinars available on their website that for folks that this year haven't been able to travel, haven't been able to do that sort of training, that's now all free and available to them. The Center for Civic Design is another group that's doing amazing work helping state and local officials redesign ballot envelopes and absentee application forms in a way that will improve the success, I think, of voters being able to fill those out correctly. Groups like the group I represent, the Elections Group, Democracy Fund, I mean, there are numbers. So there's definitely a lot of resources out there. I think the trick is, are we connecting officials to those? And that's part of why we're having conversations like this, is just to grow awareness of what's available. We're trying, but I'm sure there's an election official out there somewhere, maybe in one of your jurisdictions, that feels like they're doing this all alone, and they shouldn't be, because there's plenty of help and support.
Yeah, and we can definitely make sure that in follow-up resources, we're sharing links to some of those specific technical supports that you can make sure to forward on to your local officials. Awesome. Jennifer, I know at the beginning you were interested in kind of coming back to a couple of specific points about absentee voting. I think about the importance of changing processing deadlines and some of the nuances there. So if you'd love to, if you're interested in honing in on that, I know that there are a few folks on the line from states where that's an ongoing battle.
Yeah, and I wish that I could talk to each of you individually and understand more about what the concerns are. I'm particularly interested because, you know, in addition to this support around just election administration, I have this deep commitment to election auditing and accountability. And I think if you want to do this right, I mean, if you want to be able to account for and reconcile those ballots and account for every time they change hands, every time they change custody, there are processes in place for that, and most local offices have those. They're able to do that successfully to varying degrees, but we see that it's most successful, meaning tight chain of custody, tight logs for all of the things we account for, ballots being duplicated, ballots moving through, absentee ballots moving through that process, ballots cast in person. So meaning comparing how many voters voted, how many people checked in on the poll book, how many ballots do we actually have, right? We have all of these balancing and reconciliations that take place. And they're really important. It really is the foundation of any type of audit that you might do to validate the election. Well, when we see those being done correctly and most successfully are in jurisdictions that have enough time to process those, that they're not up against these tight deadlines of you can't start processing until election day. And by the way, your certification deadline is a few days later. Because what happens then is we rush, right? We rush to get through the process so that we can meet those certification deadlines. So I think it's really important to think about what do we want to see in the future in terms of our process, and where do the dates and deadlines that have been set in statute, where might those bump up against or cause a problem for us getting to that? And I'll just to illustrate that a little bit more, when we were implementing risk limiting audits, so post-election tabulation audit in Colorado, we recognized that if we could do this well and right, we needed to have a couple extra days. And so we were really lucky. We got some legislators who were willing to move the certification deadline back just a day or two. We weren't asking for weeks, but just a couple extra days to make sure that everything could be done correctly. And so I think, again, I know there may not be an opportunity to change that in the next 75 days, but I think it's really, really important that we look carefully at those dates.
That's great. Thanks for that. We got a question in advance from a legislator in Rhode Island, and I actually think that this is an issue that a few other states are thinking about grappling with, and it's related to voter ID and the challenges around executing and implementing voter ID laws during a pandemic. So the questions, aside from the usual problem of having a voter ID law, wondering if there are any legal arguments to temporarily halt ID laws, or if any states have done that during the pandemic, given that DMVs were closed for a long time and it was hard for people to access them, and folks don't always feel comfortable going in and getting that identification.
I'm not sure I can answer that because I don't know exactly how the process works in Rhode Island. I know one of the ways you can mitigate some of that if you have, if you invest in the infrastructure to make sure your state voter database is able to talk, to communicate with things like the DMV and other resources, so that you, as the election administrator, when that registration form comes in, that new voter that normally under law would require them to provide ID, you have a way to actually verify that. Now that requires the voter providing some information like the last four of their social or last four digits of their driver's license number, that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I would say we can connect you with some good resources. I'm sure you're already all connected with NCSL, but I'm happy to connect with NCSL and see if they have some more on there. But I'm hesitant to respond to that without really understanding what's happening with ID in Rhode Island.
I'll add quickly that, as Jen was saying, the task force hasn't taken a position on this, but there are a few cases that are currently being litigated, one in North Carolina and one in Wisconsin on the voter ID question. The Brennan Center has a really good resource that's actually lists all the current litigation that's going on right now related to the November elections, and lists in detail like the various violations that they think that the voter ID laws are violating for the November election, including like 14th and 15th Amendments, looking at the VRA and things like that. I'm happy to share that. I'll throw that in the chat.
Are there any other questions from folks live? If not, we can give people back a couple extra minutes of their time or see if the speakers have anything final to add. Thanks, Ariel, for that. All right, we can go ahead and wrap it up then. Is there anything else that folks from the task force want to chime in with? Any last words before we wrap it up?
I think I've said plenty, so I'm going to let Ariella and Corey take us out.
I'll let Ariella close us out, but one, I'm really glad that you got to see the type of expertise that we have at the task force. Jennifer is extraordinary, and we have 52 other individuals just like her who are giving their time and their energy to this effort. And thank you for taking the time and taking your energy to be a part of this conversation. We think it's very important, and we think that we have something to offer.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Ariella.
I was going to say, Corey said it all. Thank you so much for having us. And please let us know if we can be helpful in the future. If you have any further questions, we are a resource for you. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks to all of you for jumping on the line. I want to say that we held this conversation at a critical time in a really critical year. And we also realize that every state is different and that there's a lot of tailored support that folks are going to need. So we'll be reaching out with follow-up information. And we really just wanted to use this opportunity to open up the lines of communication. So SIX can provide ongoing support, so we can connect you with folks at the task force and with a range of other both national and state level partners that are all kind of working in the same direction and trying to get us to a good place for November and for elections going forward. And so we really hope to continue partnering and working with you directly on what's happening in your states. And thanks again, and just have a great rest of everyone's week, and please stay safe and try to enjoy the rest of the summer. All right, take care.